without any major war between Vienna Congress 1815 and the start of the First World War. There were smaller wars, but there were no major wars on the scale of Napoleonic War before the Vienna Congress. And the second major development in this period is very, very intensive development of new innovations in communication technology. Today we will focus on telegraph, but in the same period we had the other inventions, including the telephone and the first experiments with radio and television. We will cover it during the next few months. Today we are focusing on golden age of diplomacy and innovation, of golden age of which started with Vienna Congress and also were supported by invention of telegraph. But before we move to Vienna Congress, we will just make a quick bridge between the early 16th century and the end of Renaissance diplomacy and basically Vienna Congress or French Revolution. There are 3 centuries of quite important developments in diplomacy. We will summarize them and explain them through a few major developments and through a few personalities, including Hugo Grotius and Cardinal Richelieu. And in this period, Hugo Grotius is well known as the father of international law, the person who introduced law of nature. And just to understand how important his role was, you have to contextualize 16th century and the beginning of the battle between Catholics and Protestants, which ended up later on, as you will see, in 30 Years' War. Hugo Grotius came with a theory of the law of the nature based on human rationality and basically humanity, and argued that the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants could be overcome by using law of nature and essentially rationality. He also laid the basis for international law and for the concept of the open sea. Today's law of the sea convention is based on the concept that were introduced by Hugo Grotius. Hugo Grotius was also a diplomat. He was serving, although he was Dutch by origin, he was serving as a Scandinavian Swedish ambassador to various courts. At that time, diplomacy, as you will see during our presentation, was cosmopolitan profession, and foreigners were allowed to serve the interests of the princes and emperors regardless of their nationality. The second important person for this period of 3 centuries since the Renaissance, the end of the Renaissance Italian diplomacy and beginning of modern diplomacy with Vienna Congress is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu was the key statesman of French Empire at that time, especially in 17th century, the most powerful country in Europe. He is important for diplomacy because he stressed and he developed diplomacy as continuous process, as a permanent activity. If you can recall, we discussed that first elements of permanency in diplomacy during the Renaissance diplomacy and opening of the first embassies back in Italian city-states. Now, he established that permanency and continuity of diplomacy also by establishing in 1626 the first Ministry of Foreign Affairs, French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Therefore, what we have today as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs got the first shape by Richelieu at the beginning of 17th century. He also introduced the notion that diplomacy should be based on raison d'etre, the national interest. Basically, this is the ultimate guidance for the diplomacy. National interest. Diplomacy should be clean from the emotions, should be clean from prejudice, and it should focus only on the national interests of the countries that diplomats represent. Therefore, in a way, Hugo Grotius and Cardinal Richelieu laid the basis for the modern diplomacy, as you will see, which developed later on during the Vienna Congress. Grotius on the side of the concept, philosophy of international law, philosophy of diplomacy, and Cardinal Richelieu basically codifying the developments from the previous centuries from Byzantine diplomacy, Renaissance diplomacy, by forming the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and establishing diplomacy as profession. Now, I'm sure that you have been hearing about the Westphalian model, that we are still living in the Westphalia era. At that time, the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics, was a very important development with consequences till our days. It wasn't signed in Westphalia. Westphalia is the name of the province. There were two cities, Osnabrück and Münster, and there were a series of treaties, but these treaties formed some sort of the Westphalian state system. The core, the main elements of that system is that international order is based on sovereignty of states. Therefore, the previous centrality and sovereignty of Pope, of Holy Roman Empire that existed throughout the Middle Age was now replaced by the concept of sovereignty of states. Therefore, when you hear next time the Westphalian city-state and Westphalian model, you can recall that it was established in the 17th century as a result as a peace treaty which ended the war between Protestants and Catholic states, mainly, I would say, Northern European states which accepted the Protestant religion and Southern which basically had a Catholic religion as dominant religion. Now we are back to our main story. Therefore, we had a Renaissance diplomacy. We had 3 centuries of extremely developed international relations in Europe, characterized by Hugo Grotius and the Cardinal Richelieu and the Westphalian peace treaty as the main event. And then we have, of course, you're familiar with the French Revolution, 1789, which was the real political, social, cultural earthquake, and which basically changed Europe with enormous consequences. When they ask, which was used differently, when they ask Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, what was his thinking about the French Revolution, he said that it was too early to pass any judgment. But this is then Asian perception of the time and the processes in history. Another major development which paved the way for the Vienna Congress was an arrival of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the start of Napoleonic Wars. You will see a slight confusion with the dates. Napoleonic Wars started in 1803 and ended up in 1815. And the confusion is that the Vienna Congress started in 1814. But the reason is that obviously second arrival of Napoleon and his big battle and his big loss and the Battle of Waterloo. And that is the sort of the reason why it was prolonged beyond the Vienna Congress till 1815. Now, back to this two core messages of today's webinar. This period started the period of the golden age of diplomacy during the 19th century till the First World War, started at Vienna Congress, and in the same time, it was a period of many inventions in communication technology, mainly in telegraph technology. Therefore, we will try to follow these two developments. Diplomatic development on one side, development during the so-called concept of Europe, which was established at Vienna Congress, and developments on the side of the technological inventions. Now, Vienna Congress was obviously a big event in the history of diplomacy. Next year we will celebrate 200 years, and it was extremely successful diplomatic event. It laid the basis for the peace, which lasted almost 100 years. Well, there were conflicts, but there were no major wars, as we indicated. What we can learn from the success of the Vienna Congress was that it was organized in quite relaxed atmosphere. There were many balls, entertainment was on a high level, cuisine was excellent, delegations were big, with the composing of mistresses, friends, family members. Therefore, Vienna at that time, between September 1814 and June 1815, was a city of big festivities, and the Austrians invested heavily, especially in this entertainment and social part of the negotiation. I think that lesson is important because, as you will see later on, the Versailles peace process after the First World War was completely opposite. It was very rational, scientific negotiation of the peace with cartographers and scientists. And the results is well known from history. What happened after the First World War? We had the turbulence, and almost immediately the Second World War. Therefore, one of the lessons learned is that sometimes the social aspect, as we are aware, could be decisive for the success of the negotiations. In Vienna, there were two key players, two key personalities. Prince Talleyrand, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Clement von Metternich, Austrian Minister of Foreign Affairs. They were basically the key protagonists of the negotiation. Besides France and Austria, among the five main players were Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain. But Talleyrand and Metternich played a key role. Talleyrand managed almost impossible because the peace talks, the Vienna Congress, was organized in order to deal with Europe after the Napoleonic War. And he managed, from the side of the losing power, he managed to get into this big team of the club of the great powers, five great powers, and to influence to the large extent the outcome of negotiation. Metternich was ultimate master of ceremony. He was basically the architect of the Vienna Congress. And there is one interesting anecdote when Talleyrand died and they came to inform Metternich that his long counterpart, enemy and friend in the same time passed away. He was shocked, he was distressed, and he thought for a few minutes, and he made the following comment: "I wonder what Talleyrand, meant by this." Obviously, he passed away; it just expired. But that was the way how Metternich was framing the diplomacy and all other activities. Therefore, Vienna Congress was shaped by these two great diplomats and statesmen. Now, we will now shift to the developments of telegraph. The first mechanic telegraph was developed slightly before the Vienna Congress in the 1794 by Chapelle, the French inventor. It was developed during the French Revolution, and it gave, and you will see this historical parallel, it gave early advantage to France. Napoleon used it initially while he was trying to consolidate his power. And it was the first military use of new technology, mechanic telegraph. Mechanic telegraph consisted, and you can see here on the photo of the towers, that therefore there was in a way visual passage of the message from one tower to the other. The whole France was covered by these telegraph towers. Some of them exist today, and if you visit France, especially southern France, there is an excellent in the Chateauneuf-du-Pape, which is a very good winery, slightly north of the Aix-en-Provence. There is a famous wine which is named after telegraph, one of the telegraph towers. Immediately beside the military use, which Napoleon was excited about, there was a non-military use, sending lottery results in advance, first misused by a group of businessmen, and other countries realized that they had to develop also mechanic telegraph. They started in Great Britain, Germany. Now, one historical parallel that we can make is between Chapelle's telegraph and Minitel. I don't know how familiar you are with the development of Minitel, but it was the internet before the internet. In the 30 years ago, in the 1970s and 1980s, France developed a system which had the possibilities, functions of e-commerce, e-purchase, and the name of that system was Minitel. But again, like Chapelle's telegraph, France didn't capitalize on its invention. With the Minitel, internet became the main medium for communication. Then, from the mechanical telegraph, which was invented by Chapelle, we moved to electric telegraph, which is telegraph in a form that we know and which was used till, I would say, 10 or 20 years ago. And here we don't have one inventor, although countries are very proud and they're claiming that their inventors invented the telegraph. And the English historian Robert Sabin said that the electric telegraph did not, strictly speaking, have an inventor. It grew little by little towards perfection, with each inventor added his bit. Telegraph, electric telegraph, is very often called the internet of the 19th century, and also the way how it was developed. make an interesting parallel with the internet. Internet doesn't have one inventor. Winthrop and Bob Kahn invented TCP/IP, but later on Tim Berners-Lee and his team in CERN invented the World Wide Web. There were different inventors of FTP, email, and other tools. Here is a list of the inventors who shaped, in a way, telegraph, electric telegraph, including Chappell, Volta, who invented Italian electric batteries, Semmering, a photo version of the telegraph, Ampere, conceptual of the needle telegraph device, which was important for writing. And as you can see, it is put in bold, is Baron Pavel Schilling, a Russian diplomat, who was based in Prussia. At the time, he was representing the Russian Tsar. He was German by origin, and apparently he had plenty of free time, and he invented and made the first fully functional experiment about electric telegraph. For some reason, which is not clear for me, he's not celebrated as a big inventor. Cook and Wheatstone managed to make the first commercial use of telegraph in the United Kingdom, and then what is well known to all of us, and who is usually quoted as inventor of the telegraph, was Morse, who created the first telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore and introduced Morse code. There were various attempts to lay the cable between Europe and the United States, and we'll see in a few minutes how it impacted the history of diplomacy. Commercial use, Morse introduced the link between Washington and Baltimore, and there were attempts to lay a transatlantic cable, resulting in a fully functional and reliable link in 1816. And you will see in a few minutes how it impacted the purchase of Alaska. What were the major structural changes introduced by electric telegraph? The first was the splitting of communication and transportation. Till that time, except possible smoke signals, communication was linked to transportation. You need courier to carry the message, by carriages, by ships, by whatever transportation means were available. There was extremely interesting discussion when they had to give the name to this new device. Should it be called tachygraph, referring to reduction of the time for conveying a message, or telegraph, relating more to space? And you can see the etymology, tachy with the time, and graph to write, or tele is distance, and graph writing over distance. Telegraph won. But I think that interplay between time and space has been around till our time, and we are still discussing when it comes to internet governance. What is the key aspect? Is it the temporal aspect, time, or space, which has been altered by introduction of the internet? The third element is the structural changes introduced by electric telegraph was the internationalization of economic activities, mainly the exchange of trade information. And the telegraph laid the basis for the first globalization at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, when the world became completely globalized and information about trade started being exchanged via telegraph. What we can see from the introduction of the telegraph was also a redistribution of power. And I'm here bringing one quote from the Rothschild family. They lost the monopoly. They had a very developed communication system connecting the main European centers based on couriers and carrier pigeons. That's another way of communication at that time. And that system that was very well developed provided Rothschild with a competitive advantage in trade and commerce investment. And it suddenly disappeared with the introduction of the telegraph. Again, we can make a parallel with our time and winners and losers in the era of the internet. Rothschild obviously complained because of changes in communication patterns, and he said, it was a crying shame that telegraph has been established. If we replace the word telegraph with the word internet, the following statement would sound very contemporary. Rothschild continues. The telegraph meant that even when he went to take the water for his summer holiday, there was no respite from the business. One has too much to think about when bathing, which is not good. Sounds familiar? Great. Now, the telegraph brought some side effects, mainly for the first emancipation of women. Women were often employed as telegraph operators. It was the first secure job, greater rights, and possibility of education. And that image you can see supervisor in telegraph exchange office measuring the length of skirt of a female employee. At that time, like today with the internet, there was obviously both Techno-Suspicion and Techno-Optimism. Russian Tsar Nicholas I considered telegraph to be subversive. Afraid of its democratizing potential to disseminate information, he declined an offer by Morse at that time to develop the Russian country's first telegraph line. As a result, Russia lagged greatly behind the other major powers, and during the First World War, this proved to be disastrous for the Russian military, for the Russian army. In the same time, besides the techno-skepticism, there was techno-optimism, and here is a quote from Edward Thornton, a British ambassador, who said, "What can be more likely to affect peace than a constant and complete intercourse between all nations and individuals in the world? Steam power was the first olive branch offered to us by science. Then came a still more effective olive branch, this wonderful electric telegraph, which enables any man who happens to be within reach of a wire to communicate instantaneously with his fellow men all over the world." Does it sound familiar? Today less and less, but let's say 5 or 6 years where people were arguing that internet will, by its nature, by its enabling function, by its possibility to communicate the internet, bring the peace and stability in the world. As we know, it is much more complex, and this techno-optimism could be risky, and this is one of the concerns with techno-optimism, for example, in Silicon Valley these days, because we know what happened with the telegraph techno-optimism and how bloody was 20th century. I hope that it won't repeat, but we should be cautious about that. Now, let us come to geopolitics. Telegraph changed the environment for diplomatic activities. It introduced so-called cable geostrategy. The control of a telegraph cables became of crucial geostrategical importance. Here in this table, you have a summary of the percentage of the control of the telegraph cables from the 1892 till 1923. As you can see, there was a dominance by Britain, Great Britain, and United Kingdom from the very beginning, and it has been almost stabilized on the 80% of control of the cables. And it's interesting to make a parallel with today's digital communication. I don't know the latest results, but when I developed this presentation 4 years ago, there was more or less the same percentage of traffic which was going through UK, especially between UK and the United States, on the internet. And that is interesting to see how, in spite of a lot of excitement and a lot of perception of changes, things have been remaining more or less the same when it comes to strategical aspects. Here is the map of the cable geostrategy. And as you can see, there is a dominant, the most intensive communication is between Europe and the United States. And if you follow the lines of telegraph communication at the beginning of 20th century, you can see more or less that digital, today's internet communication is going through the same lines and through the same cables. What are the reasons for the British monopoly when it comes to the cable geostrategy? First, the need to connect to its remote colonies, mainly India, and the first submarine cables are going from Britain through Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Aden, up to India, Bombay. Britain had the control of the sea, and it helped to lay submarine cables, telegraph cables, without any major obstacles. The high cost of developing and maintaining its telegraph network was partly compensated with commercial traffic. And this is an interesting parallel. Telegraph cable network was developed by private companies. They aligned their position with the British geostrategical objectives, but ultimately they were cables were run by commercial companies, and there was commercial traffic which make them financially viable, unlike similar attempts by France and Germany. Again, we can make an interesting parallel between telegraph time and the internet era. The main strategic telegraph outposts coincide with the main trade routes: Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Alexandria in Egypt, Aden in Yemen, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Now, with the monopoly of Great Britain, France and Germany started realizing that they were losing the position in their geopolitical position. And it was clear after the Tonkin crisis and Fashoda crisis in Africa, which was a bit tragicomic when a French commander in Fashoda, they had basically France troops moved from the west to the east in order to control Africa, and British troops moved from the north to the south, and they collided in Fashoda, a small village on Nile in nowadays Sudan. And the French captain had a better position, but he had to communicate back to Paris via British telegraph cables. And obviously, British intelligence service twisted the message, and the message reached Paris with his SOS that France should conclude peace as soon as possible and withdraw from Fashoda. And after that crisis, France realized that they have to do something. Therefore, they, together with Germany, tried to develop the global network, global cable network. And here is an interesting dichotomy. While France geopolitically was siding with Britain after the Entente, which was signed in 1904, when it comes to telecommunication, France had very close relations with Germany, and therefore the Ministry of Postal and Telegraph Administration cooperated closely in development of alternatives with Germany. Another interesting geostrategic development was American purchase of Alaska. Unsuccessful American attempts to establish transatlantic cable between 1859 and 1865 led towards considering overland telegraph connection. And faced with difficulties in establishing transatlantic link, Western Union President Hiram Sibley urged the purchase of Alaska in order to establish 16-mile land-based wire between the United States and Europe through Western Canada, Russian America, across the Bering Strait, and through Siberia. When they managed to lay the first cable in 1968, it wasn't anymore necessary, but Alaska remained a part of the United States till today. There was also a big interplay between Russia and China. Russia tried to develop overland cable link towards China, and it was mainly blocked by Britain, which tried to keep this maritime cable link, which was going through the line that we already described. Okay, that was the main, what we discussed so far was the changing environment for diplomatic activities, changing geostrategy. And you could think about underlying elements which are as relevant today as they were in the 19th century with telegraph. The second impact was on emergence of new topics on diplomatic agenda. They were the first international agreement signed in order to manage telegraph communication. First, the French Baden exchange on the border for cross-border exchange, where basically they were exchanging papers with the telegraph messages. It was a network of bilateral agreements between countries about the exchange of telegraph messages. The first regional West European Telegraph Union, establishment of the ITU, which we have today here in our neighborhood in Geneva, in the 1865 in Paris, and this was one of the first international organizations which was established to manage the telegraph communication. When it comes to main international agreements, and this is really fascinating aspect, you can see the same story discussed almost 100, 150 years ago as the same issue discussed as we are discussing them today with the internet and privacy. The first point was neutrality of telegraph cables in case of war. Germany and France obviously supported it. Strong opposition by Great Britain, which managed to prevail. And one of the first acts at the beginning of the First World War, the Second World War, by Great Britain was to cut German cables, for example. The second point was the privacy of communication. And the United States and Great Britain were in that time trying to protect privacy of communication, while Russia and Germany were trying to limit privacy in order to protect state security and public order. Well, there are interesting similarities and parallels. Now, today, when we are discussing the PRISM, we can see some parallels with that discussion related to Telegraph. The third aspect is the use of Telegraph as a tool for diplomatic activities. And in the 1856, during the Congress of Paris, after the war in Crimean War, the British representative received instruction from Prime Minister Palmerston through coded telegram. It is, as history can record, the first use of telegraph, electric telegraph, for the exchange of messages. In 1866, the State Department sent a cable to U.S. mission in France. And here you can see how expensive the cost of the cable was, $20,000 US. And the total annual budget of U.S. diplomacy at that time was $150,000 US. That would be parallel, I think, with probably few $100 million nowadays. There was also voice of concern among diplomats. The telegraphic demoralization of those who formerly had to act for themselves and are now content to be at the end of the wire, were the words of British ambassador to Vienna, Sir Horace Ramboll. They complained that they were basically, if we can use today's terminology, under the remote control, because it was possible to send the messages from the capital. You have here some voice of concern by French diplomats about using typewriting machine, no more diplomatic style of handwriting, and many parallels that we can find to our times. Now, when it comes to tools, there were three important telegrams. Telegram is the word which is used for the message which was sent via telegraph, which influenced the history of diplomacy. The first was the Ems telegram, which Bismarck used in order to prepare or to provoke Franco-Prussian War and later on German unification. He basically misquoted the meeting between French ambassador and his Kaiser, and he managed through the telegraph communication to send a message to provoke France and then to provoke the war. Through Kruger telegram from the German Kaiser to Paul Kruger, the leader of the Recliner movement, also create the turmoil and led to the Boer War at the end of the 19th century. Zimmermann telegram from Berlin to the German embassy in Mexico was basically decoded deciphered by the British intelligence, and it was used by Britain and those in the United States who were siding for joining the First World War against U.S. neutrality as argument that United States should join the First World War. It was published, the content of this telegram, in which Berlin offered to Mexico, California, and New Mexico part of the United States if Mexico had joined Germany in the war against the United States. Therefore, that was the trigger when basically brought the United States on the side of allies in the First World War. Now, getting closer to Europe and recent history is the July crisis. July crisis, next year you will be probably hearing a lot about the 100 years of the start of the First World War. And one aspect of that crisis is completely underestimated, not enough studied. Therefore, if you have a time, I suggest that you spend some time focusing on this. One of the points is that telegraphic exchange at the highest level dramatized the spectacular failure of diplomacy, to which telegraphy contributed with crossed messages, delays, sudden surprises, and unpredictable timing. Basically, diplomats fail to understand the full impact of instantaneous communication without the ameliorating effect of delay. Telegraph, which was a powerful tool, was misused, not intentionally. They were the messages were crossing between Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, and creating a lot of confusion. One lesson that we should learn in our time of instantaneous communication is that speed and immediacy of communication are not beneficial in all circumstances. Therefore, face-to-face meeting, slower communication, double checking of communication could help avoiding crisis and in some cases wars and bloody conflicts. Now we are concluding this summary with this presentation with a summary of the main developments in this interplay between telegraph and diplomacy. First development was the need for urgent replies. Diplomats with a telegram were expected to provide urgent replies to the request from the other side. Sounds familiar, like in the internet era, and substantially things haven't changed dramatically between introduction of telegraph and our time, because telegraph introduced the direct communication and expectations were more or less similar. There was the major problem of coordinating communication, as one the British Prime Minister commented it, that telegraphing work is despairing. It will be a mercy if we do not get into some confusion. And they got into confusion before the First World War. Therefore, there was a problem to coordinate communication. One aspect which was clearly illustrated by the enormously expensive telegram sent by US diplomacy to their envoy in France was the cost of telegraph messages, and it led to the need to prepare concise messages, and which wasn't necessarily bad, some sort of Twitter messaging of the 19th century, but it created a problem of reduced context. With the short messages in a few paragraphs, it was difficult to describe context, which is essential for diplomacy. Telegraph facilitated also the emergence of foreign policy bureaucracy, ministries of foreign affairs, diplomatic service, as integrated system with embassies abroad and ministries as a hub of the overall systems. It led, as we realized, by British diplomats who complained to be on the remote control from the capital, to centralization of diplomacy. And that also led, especially that statesmen moved from the leaders to become followers, and they were not, in many cases, prepared to handle a new technology. And I think we are seeing some of those elements today with the introduction of the internet. Now, I will conclude with this image illustration about prediction of the future from the late 19th century with some sort of Skype. Somebody was really imaginative and got the idea that one day we'll have some sort of Skype communication. Now, in the conclusion, I would like to stress just a few points. One is that this period was decisive. The period after Vienna Congress was decisive for development of diplomacy. It was influenced heavily by technology, by telegraph, and we'll see next month by telephone as well. And that impact laid the basis for diplomacy that more or less we know today, with the infrastructure, ministries and embassies, the way of communication, diplomatic reports as a key way of exchange of information between embassies and ministries of foreign affairs. Therefore, by studying this period, we can learn a lot about our time, and in some cases, like the telegraphic confusion before the First World War, we can avoid mistakes and create more optimal solutions for the potential confusion and conflict. That is all on telegraph and diplomacy. Now the floor is yours, and you can make a comment and ask the questions. I will check if there are some comments already. Okay, that's good. Okay, sound is good. To ask a question, please type your question in chat. Okay, those are. Sometimes quotation telegraph for peace, like internet for peace. If telegraph created diplomatic robots at the end of the wire, then it was seriously narrowed the world's view rather than expanding it. This is good point. And one of the reasonable arguments is that diplomats who were on the remote control from the capital reduced their room for maneuver, and they were today people who know the best the context. They're on the ground, they're on the spot. They can understand the atmosphere in particular capital, which you cannot get even in this time of the CNN in the internet. Therefore, it was important aspect, and I think lost for diplomacy, that heavy centralization of diplomatic services. Those questions, please type your question. Okay, that's technical issue. Fine. While we are waiting for the questions, you will receive tomorrow text from the previous month. My apology for the sending with the delay, the text for the Renaissance diplomacy, and summary text from this presentation. And you will also receive the questionnaire to answer the question and check your knowledge about both Renaissance diplomacy and diplomacy after Vienna Congress. It is important that the VAR gain priority over the person. That's true. In the old McLuhan way, these are just wrote the medium rather than the message. In diplomacy, that interplay between medium and the message is always risky because of the need to contextualize the message to specific circumstances, cultural, political, social circumstances in the countries where diplomats are posted. And people from the capital cannot grasp that complexity. Therefore, the most successful diplomatic services today have managed to establish right balance between independence of their envoys and their room for maneuver to make initiatives and to make local actions and the centralization to the level of the coordination of the overall diplomatic service. Because it is useful for diplomats in China to know what his counterpart, his colleague is doing in India, because they then can compare, they can coordinate diplomatic activities. But over-centralization, which happens especially in early days of Telegraph, and I think nowadays with the internet, is not healthy for diplomacy. Great. Thank you for your time, attention, and I hope that this presentation will inspire you to think about internet through the lenses of the developments with the telegraph. Telegraph is often called the internet of the 19th century. I wish you a pleasant and nice weekend. Please check your email, maybe not during the weekend, on Monday, and you will find the background text and the questions and the questionnaire for recapitulation of the knowledge. Great.